Hello and welcome to the first lecture for this class. Today we're going to talk about daily life in Europe, roughly from the time period of 1600 to about 1800. A few themes will be addressed in this presentation. First of all, we're going to look at daily life for a wide range of different people living during this time period. We'll look at life for the wealthy or members of the nobility, as well as the masses or peasants. We'll look at the type of food that they ate, their clothing, the homes they lived in, and what they did for fun or entertainment. Before we get too far, I'd like to identify the structure of society. In a way, society was shaped like a pyramid. There were a handful of people at the top. These were members of the nobility or lords, making up between 1 and 5% of the population. Below them were members of the clergy, about 5 to 10%. And below them would be the bourgeoisie, as much as 10% of the population. Beginning in the late 1600s and continuing to the 1700s, the bourgeoisie is a term that's generally referred to as the growing middle class, particularly in France. These included shopkeepers, skilled workers, business owners, etc. On the left, we see an image of a shopkeeper who's getting ready to go to work. While the nobles, clergy, and bourgeoisie took up the top of this pyramid, the masses provided the foundation, and the bulk of the people living in Europe in this era were made up of the so-called masses. We'll talk about them quite a bit today. Now that we've explored some themes and the structure of society, we'll look at the nobility in England as well as in France. The smallest, wealthiest, and easiest nobility to describe were aristocrats living in Great Britain. The British aristocracy included about 400 families. The oldest male of each sat in the House of Lords. Their power? Well, they had the ability to pass all laws. Membership in the House of Lords was based on your family history. The eldest male in each family inherited the position in the government. On the left, we see some images of the clothing that people wore. If you've ever seen an episode of Downton Abbey, well, they were members of the aristocracy. And the House of Lords is still in place today. However, members of the House of Lords do run for those positions. It's not simply based on heredity today. In France, things were not so clear-cut. There were two types of nobles in France: nobles of the sword and nobles of the robe. Nobles of the sword obtained their title by serving in the military. Nobles of the robe served the king in some other fashion. Usually, they purchased their title. You may be asking, well, why would somebody purchase a title of nobility? Well, one of the advantages in France of being a noble was that you didn't have to pay taxes. The clothing for members of the nobility was quite elaborate. Here we see a woman who's got really fancy hair, and look how tall her hair is. And the diameter of her dress is quite wide. And as you see, some dresses were as wide as 9 feet in diameter. Members of the elite would wear shoes that had buckles, flowing gowns made of expensive fabric. They'd also have jewels embedded inside them, on the fabric themselves. Alright, so how many of you have seen The Hunger Games? People living in the capital had elaborate clothing, and in a lot of ways it was influenced by the clothing that was common in France during the time period that we're talking about. And on the right, we see how Katniss's drab clothing is contrasted to that of Effie's. Men as well as women were known for dressing in an elaborate manner in France. On the right, we see a gentleman. It was common at the time for men to wear wigs. They would shave their head, and then they would wear a wig. There were over 1,200 wig shops in Paris alone. We also see the types of pants that this gentleman is wearing. Those are called culottes, or knee breeches. France today is known for its fashion. Well, the very first fashion magazine was published in France in 1672. Members of the nobility engaged in unique forms of entertainment. As one person put it, it was an age of strict manners and loose morals. Today we think of people getting married for love. Well, back then, they often married in order to enhance their family's fortunes. So that meant if they wanted to find love, well, they would find it often outside of marriage. They also engaged in gambling, hunting, they played tennis, went to operas, had elaborate dinner parties, and many other forms of entertainment. Different regions of Europe specialized in different forms of entertainment. I was lucky enough several years ago to travel to Moscow, and I went to a ballet at the Bolshoi. This was originally a dance school, and then it opened as a theater in the 1800s. Let me tell you, it was a spectacular ballet for me to watch. Gambling was quite common. One of the things that's interesting is that this was a form of entertainment where both the rich and the poor would come together. At different casinos, they would also play the lottery. The French were known for their food and their exotic dinner parties. There would be a wide range of different foods, starting with the bread, but then here's an example of what one member of the nobility had. 4 plates of soup, a pheasant, a partridge, 2 slices of ham, a salad, mutton with garlic, and it ended with a pastry. Exotic spices, as well as things like coffee, also could be common. One of the keys for members of the nobility was the variety in their diet. Dinner parties could go on for hours, and by 1660, napkins became common. It was no longer acceptable to wipe your face on a tablecloth. They had individual napkins for people in polite society. Now that's just a little bit dealing with members of the nobility. I'd like to switch gears now and talk about life for the masses. Just to start us off, the average life expectancy for the so-called masses was much shorter than the nobility, maybe by 15 to 20 years. The biggest killers were disease and accidents. Medical care in general was lacking during this time period, and there was very little understanding of germs or the spread of diseases. If you were poor, you didn't have the wherewithal in order to have a doctor come to your home, so you might have to go to a place like this, the Hotel Dieu. Sometimes, different patients, like 5 or 6, might sleep in the same bed. This allowed disease to spread very quickly. In some cases, patients simply went to the Hotel Dieu to die. Another factor that led to the high death rate was their diet. Their diet was monotonous, almost the same every single day. The staples were black bread and beer. Men, women, as well as children drank beer, often more commonly than water, and they would have bread day after day. Yes, they would have access to meat, but usually only about twice a month, something like that. And the only time that fresh vegetables were available was during certain seasons. The poor diet made people susceptible to disease. Now I'd like to look at family life, a life for women, and the so-called family economy. Family life was characterized by the family economy. What I mean by this is that each member of the family had a particular role in a way that they contributed to family life. For example, men or fathers were usually the ones in charge of plowing and planting, running a shop. They were the ones who made decisions when it came to their family. And sometimes they would remain within the family unit itself, but sometimes if there was a problem with crops in a certain area, they might leave and they might become migrant workers and work somewhere else, raise some money, and then bring it back home. Women, or mothers, quite literally at times, were carriers for their husbands. They might follow their husband as he was engaged in planting seeds and crops in the spring. They were in charge of child rearing and raising their families, raising their children. They often became deputy husbands. And by this, I mean if something happened to their husband, if their husband was gone as a migrant worker or their husband had died, they would have to assume the roles that were traditionally held for men. Women also, at times, earned extra money for their families. Women often engaged in different forms of cottage industry, the most common of which would be shown here. Here we see a woman at a spinning wheel. You want to make sure you don't prick your finger on that. Anyway, what might happen is that women might have some raw wool, and then they would spin it, and they would make some extra money. And then someone, often a traveling salesman, would come by and pick up that wool that had been spun so that it could be transformed into different types of clothing. And that was a way for women to contribute and to make some extra money for their families. Children played an important role in this family economy. Usually they started working about the age of 7. Unfortunately, however, about a quarter of all infants died before they reached the age of 1. Nearly half by the age of 10, so there was a very high infant mortality rate. One other group I want to mention would be servants. Often, even poor families would have servants living in their homes, but they weren't slaves. They would eat with members of the family, and they would make a very small wage. When young couples got married, there was an expectation that a woman would provide a dowry to her husband. This was wealth given by a bride to her husband when they got married. Girls would try to raise extra money and save it in order to have a large dowry to attract a husband.
I'd like to make some quick links to the book Tidelands. This is a fictional story, of course. However, I do think that it helps to provide some examples of what life was like for women in Europe in this era. In particular, if we look at dowry, Eleanor's daughter Alice wants to get married. However, what we'll see is one of the big issues with the plot line is her desire to increase her dowry so she could marry the boy of her choice.
There were very few opportunities for women when it came to different jobs. Many women worked as wet nurses. They would nurse the child or an infant of another person. They also became prostitutes. There were between 40 and 60,000 registered prostitutes in Paris. There was an awful lot of abandonment as many children were born out of wedlock, and they ended up in orphanages. In fact, the death rate was appalling at some of these orphanages, as 1 in 10 in some cases lived. That means 9 out of 10 died. In this era, women had very few legal rights. In England, it was legal for a husband to beat his wife as long as that stick that he was using was no larger than his thumb. That's the origin of the phrase rule of thumb. Next, we'll explore some additional aspects of peasant life in this era. Now, just as a bit of review, about 75, maybe as much as 80% of Europe's population lived as peasants and serfs. They didn't own the land. They rented it from members of the nobility. In a way, they were similar to slaves because they could be bought and sold and traded. One of the great absurdities that members of the peasantry faced was the tax system in countries like France. Members of the nobility, as well as the clergy, did not pay taxes. That meant that the bourgeoisie and the peasants did. The irony here is those with the least amount of money paid the most in taxes. And peasants were stuck with something that they absolutely hated. This was called the corvée. Each year, because they generally didn't have the cash in order to pay their taxes, they would work somewhere between 12 to 15 days of the year for the state, building roads, bridges, and different things like that. That was the way that they paid their taxes, with that corvée, and they absolutely hated it. In some cases, members of the peasantry rebelled against the conditions that they faced. One famous rebellion was in Russia, and it involved this gentleman, Emelian Pugachev. Pugachev was a member of the military, yet he deserted from his position. He ended up leading a mass rebellion that involved as many as 20,000 members of the peasantry. They attacked the conditions that they faced during the rule of Catherine the Great. Eventually, his army controlled a large area in eastern Russia called Kazan. The area here, which is circled, shows the city of Kazan. Once his forces controlled this city, Catherine the Great amassed a large army to go after Pugachev and his men. Eventually, Pugachev's men were surrounded. One of his supporters gave him up and was a traitor and turned him over to the Russian officials. He was captured tortured, and executed. After his execution, they cut his body into 4 parts and posted the parts of his body on different parts of the city as a warning. You don't want to rebel against the Russian government, or this would happen to you. This ended the rebellion. Thus far, I've been identifying life in the countryside. Next, I'd like to look at life for urban workers, and particularly guild life. Paris was the largest city in Europe in 1600. It had a population between 450 and 500,000. This drawing shows Paris in 1607. Right in the middle is Notre Dame, the famous cathedral. Things were so crowded in different parts of Europe, they even built shops on the bridges. This is a famous shop called the Ponte Vecchio in Florence, Italy. Still in place today. During the Middle Ages, the guild system evolved. Here we see the origins of modern industry and education. It established a training or education system whereby people were trained in a range of trades. One of the most important industries was the cloth industry. Here we see some guild workers dyeing the cloth a different color. On the left, we see a portrayal of glassmaking, and on the right, a butcher shop. The head of an individual guild shop would be the master. This was the shop owner, and you could become a master only if you had enough money and connections. Below the master would be the journeyman. They would earn wages, plus they would receive room and board. If someone was learning the trade, they would be an apprentice. They worked for room and board, but they did not earn a wage. Usually you would have to work 7 years, and you'd have to show that you had obtained your skills. Unskilled laborers were at the bottom of this system. Just as society is characterized by a triangle, so too were the guilds, with the master on the top and unskilled laborers at the bottom.
Again, if I can make another link to the reading in Tidelands, Eleanor's son Rob would eventually receive an apprenticeship, and when he does, this has a huge impact on the potential earnings for their family. And so again, here's another connection where we can see this fictional story can actually help to provide some insight as to events in Europe in this era.
The last thing I'd like to address would be fun or entertainment for the masses. One form of entertainment would be public punishments. These were done often in a town square so that everyone could see individuals who had done something wrong. It was a form of social control in a way. Alright, I know this is a goofy picture of me, but if a person was publicly humiliated like this, they would be less likely to commit a particular crime again. And also, people saw this public humiliation, and it served as a form of deterrent so that they wouldn't steal or do something that they weren't supposed to be doing in society. I know I mentioned this before, but both the wealthy and the masses were engaged in car playing, they went to casinos, and they gambled. One thing that the masses were engaged in would be cockfighting. They often gambled on cockfights, as 2 roosters were often placed in a ring, and they fought to the death. This blood sport was quite common. The masses often went to taverns as well. They drank a lot of beer or ale, yet toward the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century, alcoholism and alcohol abuse became much more common, as in some cases, like in London, people switched from beer and ale to gin, which was much more potent. Christian ceremonies often were a time of celebration, and here we see a painting depicting a christening. Last thing I'd like to point out would be club sports, particularly Football, or what Americans call soccer. Quite a common sport for lots of people to play. Now that we've finished the bulk of the lecture, I'd like to end with some concluding ideas. Well, this lecture has addressed daily life in Europe beginning at about 1600 and extending to about 1800. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to write an essay that explains what life was like for the wealthy, what life was like for the masses, and as you do so, try to address characteristics such as food, family life, what they did for fun, their clothing, and other characteristics. Well, that's all for today. I hope you learned something new, and hopefully it was interesting. Anyway, take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye.